Hey guys, welcome back to DIY guitar making. What I'm going to show you today is how to get some really sweet looking miters at the various points where your binding scheme comes together. So this is a bit of an advanced tip here, and I'm going to try not to get lost in the weeds of how to cut binding channels and everything like that, because some of you guys may already be somewhat familiar with that concept, and really what I'm trying to do is build upon the idea of binding and cutting binding channels and installing the binding by showing you how luthiers get that really cool framed look of the body where in this case, the white lines of the maple purfling seem to meet at a corner and then turn. How do we get those various miters? This one's all prepared, so I'm going to show you a bit of what I'm talking about. And then after this, I'm going to actually show you how to execute this, because I have a whole nother guitar body that I'm doing this to. I have to go cut the binding channels for it and do all the other work to get to this point. So you'll see that in just a moment. But let me see if I can hold all this together just to show you. Alright, so that's probably the best I can do holding it together. Obviously, I need to glue this later on, and that is what we're after here. There's a lot of ways to do this, to do the meeting points between your end wedge and the binding. And what a lot of people do for simplicity is you can just run your purfling right over it like that. And that can look really good too, but I think there's something a little bit extra slick looking and sophisticated with your binding setup if you can manage. And again, it's a bit more work, a bit more advanced, but if you can manage to have all your purfling be mitered and turn at those points. Alright, so let's put this guitar number 87 on its shelf here. And I'm going to go ahead start cutting the binding channels for the Wengi guitar, guitar number 86, the other parlor guitar. Alright, so we're going to cut the back binding channels first. I'm going to do the top binding channels too, which they're going to have their own issues with connecting the purfling scheme, which is going to be this cool dyed blue poplar and maple strips that I have on the Rosette. Same kind of thing for the purfling. Alright, but we're over here. I've got my carrier. I actually had to make, because this is such a small body size, I had to make a whole special dedicated binding carrier just for my parlor guitars. That's what happens when you make a size instrument that is so far removed from the typical OM, dreadnought, jumbo kind of sizes that are common in our culture. Okay, nope, I'm doing this backwards, hold on. So we need to load up the carrier on this side here so that we can then flip it over and cut the back binding channels. So the key insight that I can give as to how to do this is that it matters greatly the order of operations that you do things when you want those purfling lines to meet up and wrap and create that framing effect. So I'll tell you what the order that I'm going to do is right now. And it is different, you know, I've arrived at this order through experimentation over time. That's not to say that other builders haven't arrived at the same exact conclusion. They probably have, but also other builders may do this in a slightly different order. It's really all about just sitting down and thinking ahead, right? Thinking what's going to happen once I make this cut. What does that allow me to do later? So, with that said, what I'm going to do is route the binding channel all the way around on the back and route the purfling channel, which is just a tiny narrow ledge for holding that maple strip. As you'll see, there's a little area here that I stopped short of with the binding tower jig to leave a little bit of wood there. And that's really the key part of this whole thing. So stick around to the end to see what I do with the hand tools in this section. Then I'm going to route the pocket for my end wedge, install the end wedge, and sand that back. And we're going to come in with hand tools and very carefully work that area. And I'm a little bit nervous about how this wengi is going to react to the cutter on the binding towers. And so I'm going to just wipe some True Oil on the surface here, which is going to at least partially seal that grain, which can mitigate the sort of splintering and the tear out that you might get. I'm sure I'll still get the fuzzy edges that stand up at the edges of the binding channel. That's not a problem. I just always pull those up before I glue the binding in. What I really don't want to get is tear out. The wengi is a very splintery material, I find. So it's prudent to do this. All right, you might wonder why I got the middle of the back and not just right at the edges. That's simply because I know I'll be installing the binding with tape, and that tape has a tendency to pull up little itty-bitty fibers. Not a big deal, but since I can help that a little bit with the True Oil, I'm going to go ahead and do that. First, I'm going to set the height so that the back is level here in preparation for binding. I need this surface to be level. And I'm going to do that with my fancy ruler here, which is just a stick, a piece of scrap wood with a single mark on it, because it doesn't matter exactly what height I set this to, just that I set it to the same height at all four corners. Alright, that looks good. You ever get that tipping? It's actually really difficult to get an object to rest on 4 points simultaneously. It's very easy to get it to rest on 3 points. Think, for example, of a regular table with 4 legs, or one of those little corner tables that just has 3 legs. The 4-leg table is much more likely to tip in one place. So the trick to getting rid of that little tipping that we hear there is to figure out which orientation, either like this or like this, which orientation is more true. So if I put my finger here to hold it down in the orientation that rests on this pillar here, and I check that, now while still holding that side down, I'm going to check this, and that looks pretty good. Now if I do the opposite, hold that down, this looks low now. So this orientation resting on here I don't like. That's our true orientation. So now I'm essentially resting on these 3 points and I'm perfectly level, okay? This 4th point right here, I'm just going to loosen this and lift it up until it meets the body, and then we're good. We've got no more tipping. Loosen that and push it up just a hair until it meets the body. And there it is. And I can, recheck that again just to be sure, but there's no reason why that shouldn't now be perfectly level. and with no tipping. So that is just a really cool tip for you guys that, I mean, I remember when I first figured that out, and I had probably made a dozen guitars before then, more than a dozen. And so I'm not going to carry you through the whole process of cutting these channels again, because this isn't a video about simply cutting binding channels. It's about getting those miters. But maybe well, I'll end it there. So here's another little tip for you guys. I'm getting ready to do the secondary channel on here for the thin little maple purfling strip. And as you can see on my bearing here, well, let me first start by saying, as many of you guys may be aware of if you're familiar with using a binding tower to cut binding channels, it works by having a set of bearings of various sizes. And the smaller the bearing that you put on here means the larger the thickness of the, or the depth, you might say, of the channel that you're cutting. Okay? Sometimes, though, you end up wanting a channel depth that is between two of the sizes that you have, meaning with one bearing the channel's too big, and with the other bearing the channel's too small. So you want that Goldilocks bearing that exists right in the middle, and you can get that by simply putting tape, a single strip of tape, around the bearing. Well, there you go. That gives me the in-between size that I needed. All right, so I'm going to cut the purfling channels now. All right, let's do it. Okay, it's really hard to see what I'm about to show you here just because of the lighting and because of the little fuzzy edges standing up at the edge of the channel kind of conceal what I'm talking about. But I'll just tell you what I have here. So it's very important for this process to get these perfect miters that on the purfling ledge, I stop just short of the backstripe here, because I want to actually leave a little bit of material there, which I'm going to then, much later, I'm going to score that material and remove it with a chisel, and then with that same chisel, cut those miters right into the either the fiber strip or, in this case, the maple that I have here. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting the entire purfling channel and leaving just the tiniest bit here so that I can come back later with my hand tools to mate that up perfectly. But for now, I'm moving on to the binding and purfling channels of the soundboard side before we do the end wedge. Okay, got my body held in the radius vise that I have here. The radius on the vise simply ensures that it's only ever pinching down on the outside edges, the rims of the guitar, whereas if these vise jaws were flat, I would for sure be putting pressure on the center of the back plate and the top, and very easily would be collapsing and splitting the back and the top, and that's not good. So this is something I made, by the way. You can just cut a radius into two 2x4s and make a vise out of it. So this is all for the purpose of cutting the end wedge now, and I've got my special vise here, which is actually a part of the neck angle jig that I use by a company called Luthier Tool, and you can see I've made a special template for the shape and taper of end wedge that I want to have. But first, before I use this template, I have to use this alignment template to get this lined up on center. By the way, I used to, before I started using this, I use this just for the speed and efficiency of it, but I used to cut my end wedges by hand and install them that way. That's the way I show it in the online course. If you're a part of the online guitar building school, that's the way I teach it there, because most people aren't going to have some of the fancier equipment that I have here. But nowadays, just so you know, I'm doing it with a router. It's quicker. A router and a template. That method works. So I've got this lined up. The alignment template pops right out, and the end wedge template goes into place. Now I can take the router and set my depth. The depth is very important here because I need to set the depth so that it's slightly less than my binding channels, or at the very most, it's exactly the depth of my binding channels, but better to err on the side of slightly less, because we don't want the pocket that we're cutting to show up beyond the depth of the binding channel on the backplate surface or on the top surface. Okay? So bottom that out on the guitar, and I've got a little template here, or not template, just a dummy stick here for quickly and easily setting the depth that I want, which is very shallow. There we go. Okay, and that's it. Very simple process for cutting end wedge pockets. And this is my end wedge right here, just a piece of ebony. So I've got my ebony wedge, and I also have my maple purfling strip material. And so I'll just break this off to about the size I need, plus a little bit more. And just wedge those in there as well. Okay, and now before I glue this in, I'm just going to mark, this end wedge is very tall right now, so I'm going to mark where I want to cut it down before I glue it in, cut that on the bandsaw, and then we're good to go. Okay, give that a final look before it gets glued in. Looks good. It's a super simple glue up here. I'll just pop these out, run some glue in the pocket, and I like to be a little excessive with the glue in this case. The extra glue squeeze out doesn't cause any problems in this situation here. And I like to take the end wedge itself, and I'm just going to use the sides of this to move this around and push the glue up against the edges. Also, at the same time, that's getting the edges of this, it's getting glue on the edges of the end wedge, which is good because we need glue not only up into these corners, but also we want there to be glue between these strips and the ebony piece. So that easily gets glue everywhere in all the appropriate places. Okay, press that down. So love doing inlays with tapered wedges like this, because all you have to do is pull and wedge it into place, and it will take up any little micro gaps. Just going to get some of that heavy glue out of there before I then put my weight on top And there it is. So we'll leave that alone. I did get a little piece of tear out. I'm not sure if you guys saw it there in the camera at the top of my where the end wedge meets the top of the binding channel, and that's just something that I'm gonna have to deal with a little bit later, which is cool because I'm actually gonna show you how easy it is to hide little things like that on dark woods like wengi, like rosewood, like ebony. But we'll save that for later. And actually, that's all I'm going to do for today on this. This is a two-part episode here. So in the next part, I will be showing you that component of this job where the hand tools come together and we perfect those little miters. All right. See you guys later. Bye for now. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.